Welcome to the Better Birth podcast. This is episode 1 of season 11, and I am really excited to be talking about our topic today because my guest and I have been just ranting about this topic before we hit record. And I think this is a really topical episode to go live now because it's really needed. So I am very happy to welcome my lovely friend Samantha Gadsden on today. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Erin and everyone.
And we are going to be talking about the Big Baby trial today, aren't we? Oh, we have lots to say. Before we start going off on a rant, because it's going to descend into a rant, I'm pretty sure. Do you want to just introduce yourself for anybody that doesn't know who you are?
Hi, so I'm Samantha. I run the Home Birth Support Group UK, the Village, which is my life and parenting support group. I have my free birth course. I do lots of sort of hour chats on all things now, not just birth. I'm trying to get that across a bit more, really. And yeah, a whole series of subgroups and things like that just kind of, yeah, that's me. I think there's about 27,000 people in my Facebook groups.
Yeah, if you are pregnant, you need to be in Sam's Facebook groups because there is a wealth of information in there in her guides, and there's tons of community support. Everyone's supporting each other. They are invaluable, like genuinely really useful groups to join. So I'll make sure that I link those in the show notes.
Yeah,
So that
I should
people can
probably
find
say
them.
that I'm a doula as well. I kind of forget
You
that
are.
bit these days. And yeah, and I think that the power of the groups is just the peer-to-peer support. Erin,
Yeah.
you just touched on that. It's the support of other people who are going through what you're going through.
Yeah. So the purpose of today's episode is to discuss the Big Baby trial. And I'm going to say that if you follow me on Instagram, most people will know that I love reading a research study, and it's something that I think over the years I've become known as, some person who's like the research queen. I don't like using it, makes me cringe when I say that. Other people have called me that. I do not call myself that. But the Big Baby trial, I'm going to say it was hard to read through that because it is a rambling mess of a study, in my opinion. So before we start analysing and picking holes in the study, which is what I plan to do, I just want to talk a little bit about what the Big Baby trial is and what they were aiming to show.
Yeah.
So this is a study looking at suspected big babies, not confirmed, okay, because we can't confirm the size of the baby until the baby is born. And they wanted to see if performing an earlier induction at 38 weeks, between 38 and 38 plus 4, helped reduce the chances of brachial plexus palsy and shoulder dystocia, compared to what they called the standard care group. I'm doing air quotes here because standard care is laughable as a term. The standard care group was either waiting for spontaneous labour or induction. Okay, just induction later than 38 plus 4. So there were people induced in both groups in this study. So we're not looking at induction versus no induction. We're looking at earlier induction versus later induction. Okay. So this is what the study was trying to look at, basically to see whether the incidence of shoulder dystocia was reduced by performing an earlier induction. And one thing I think that's really important is to understand with this is that people who had pre-existing diabetes were excluded. Anybody who had a pre-planned C-section were excluded. Anyone who had a pre-planned induction of labour was excluded. We also need to mention that the study was closed early. I think from interpreting, and again, they go really round the houses with this, but I think they stopped the study because it wasn't showing what they wanted it to show. So they didn't actually recruit the amount of people that they wanted to.
I think I just want to add, are you going to lose your train of thought if I added
No,
that
you
they
go ahead.
excluded anyone having a home birth? They were not looking to look at what happens if we leave it alone. Or they were supposed to exclude home birthing women, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. So this is what they were aiming to show. aiming to show. And I've already had in my DMs student midwives who have said that the midwives they work with have said that the study was closed early because they didn't need any more participants because it was such a good study. Wrong. I've already had somebody in my comment section being quoted the big baby trial justifying an earlier induction because she has a suspected big baby. So we know, and this study only came out, was it a week ago or 2 weeks ago? So this is a really recent study. It's already being used to justify induction for a suspected big baby. And this is an issue because the study did not show what they wanted it to show, despite them spinning it, right?
And what it did show is that 60% of the babies that they labelled big, and let's not forget that when I started as a doula, which was only 12 years ago, big babies were over £10. They also changed the definition of big baby. Didn't they change it to £9 in this study? 60% of those babies weren't big anyway.
Yep. I think that's one of the biggest findings, right? Which is just swept under the carpet. No one's shouting about that from the people that conducted the research study. 60% of suspected big babies weren't big, and were actually under the 90th centile, which screams that growth scans are not accurate. Okay, so I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that we need to take away from this study is that if you're being told you're having a big baby, statistically they're probably not.
Yep.
And even if they are, it's not necessarily an issue. They found that 96% of suspected big babies did not experience shoulder dystocia. And
even in induction.
Yeah.
In induction.
Yep. And I think this is a really important point, which Sam, I mentioned to you before we started recording, because I had to go back and check what I'd written because I thought I was wrong, and I'm not wrong because I've just checked it. There were 2 cases of brachial plexus palsy in the, again, air quotes, standard care group. So people that were offered an induction later or maybe had spontaneous birth. So that's 0.1%, okay, in the standard care group had brachial plexus palsy, and 4 cases of brachial plexus palsy in the people that were induced early. That's 0.3. So either way, statistically, really small chance of brachial plexus palsy. And actually, the rates were higher in the earlier induction group than they were in the standard care group. So just if anyone that's listening doesn't know what brachial plexus palsy is, because I'm just conscious that we're potentially talking about things people don't understand. Brachial plexus palsy is where baby's shoulder gets potentially stuck, and it can cause nerve damage in that area. In most cases, it's not permanent.
And what Shelley explained the other day is they keep saying to people, "Oh, we'll have to break your baby's shoulder." And Shelley was explaining that actually nerve damage can be longer lasting than breaking the baby's shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of using emotive, frightening language. And obviously you don't want either to happen. But of the 2 options, it can be not the best thing to be doing anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I know.
I'm like
throwing her hands up in the air. She's like, "Give me strength."
I'm horrified by this trial. This trial is the most horrifying thing that I have come across in the entire time I've been running the home birth group.
And you've this. I know because we chat regularly, like on a practically daily basis, right? I know that you've been shouting about this for ages, like way before this study actually got published. You've been saying how unethical this study is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So this study first came to my attention through the Home Birth Support Group UK, where home birthing members were supposed to be excluded from this trial. So they weren't supposed to be coerced into induction for big baby. They were supposed to be left alone. And I was beginning to hear from members that they were being, told that their babies were enormous, told that they needed to be induced, frightened into induction, consultants banging on at them about induction, and then asked to join this trial. Not before. It wasn't, there's this trial going on, let's have a rational discussion. It was big baby, big baby, big baby, big baby, risk, 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 risk. Would you like to be on this trial? Often after induction had been agreed. So to me, this is supposed to be a randomized control trial. I'm no researcher. and I don't pretend to be. I don't like stats. My brain goes off on it completely. But what I can see quite clearly, and my friend tells me it's like neurodiverse pattern recognition, is I can see when patterns are developing in my group. And I could see from my group that the way that this trial was being implemented, and this trial went into 75 trusts, maybe even more, 75 hospitals. How can you control a trial that is actually that big? And I could see, and I still don't understand, and nobody's able to give me an answer. If you frighten somebody into being induced, how is that a randomized control trial? Because the induction is already decided. And when you've terrified somebody, how is the impact of you terrorizing that person being measured? Because if that person's already frightened when they're walking into the birth room and we're excluding normal birth. So I have been screaming about this trial, and then COVID happened, and then we know what the birth world is like. There's always something to be worried about. But it's always been in my radar, and I have said since this trial came out that whatever the results of this trial were, I believe that this trial has been fundamentally flawed. I spoke to consultants. I spoke to consultant midwives. I got invited to go in and talk to them. And I was like, it doesn't matter what you say to me about this trial. I am hearing enough from people that I think your trial is flawed. And also, we talked about this the other day, in the sonographers' rooms, in where you go in to have your scans, there was posters, big baby trial, pastel pink, pastel blue, big baby, in big letters, while you're just being scanned. It was so coercive. I went in with one of my clients. She was being induced necessarily. Yeah, because my clients don't get induced unnecessarily. Very few of them do get induced. And, all over the induction wards is these big baby posters everywhere you turned, on the wall, in the room. And then it was just all, and then there was the induction party on Twitter. So they were giving midwives Amazon vouchers, and it's been pulled. And I've been looking for the photos, but I've changed laptops and I can't find them. And on Twitter, there was this 50 participants, 50 recruited, however they worded it. And, it was an induction party. Their Twitter feed was an induction party. And then when people noticed it and they just pulled it.
Yeah.
And it was the recruitment to this trial was just abysmal. Before we even look at what what they've done to the interpretation of the results. There is nothing wrong, in my non-medical, extremely experienced opinion, in having a chunky baby.
No.
And some of these babies are not big. Well, we know that 60% of them aren't big, but we see regularly in the home birth group people birthing babies over £10. With no issues. They avoid sweeps. They don't go along with what people want, and they have babies. And
This is
nobody
the
is
issue,
looking
right?
at that.
Yeah, because when you have somebody with a suspected or a confirmed, big, or its baby turns out to be big, we know that there is a whole load of other factors other than just the size of the baby that impacts whether potentially you have complications, right? What position, if everyone's birthing on their backs in a hospital bed, then that's going to increase the chances potentially of issues of birthing any size baby, right?
Yeah.
But there is a whole lot of other factors which they've not looked at in this study, and I think it's an issue because the outcomes of this study are being twisted to fit a narrative to justify induction.
And which form of induction?
Yeah.
It's not induction. People talk about induction as if it's one thing. Let's have an induction. But what? A sweep, a pessary, a balloon, the dilation rod. Where are we going with this? Where are we in the induction process? And you can't. It's one of my bugbears about induction is people talk about it and women go to hospital, people go to hospital, they don't even know what they're going in for. They don't even understand that they're going in for a step. There can be 6 or 7 processes. So how can you have an induction trial that's not even looking at what form of induction was used?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it was an induction trial. Nearly everybody on this trial, was it 70% in the standard care? And I find the term standard care offensive because there was nothing standard about what they were doing to the people in this trial. And yes, I know there are women who are really pleased with the outcome of what happens to them on this trial, but there are many who weren't.
Yeah. So I'm going to read some of the some quotes from the study. okay, and we can talk about them. Because I think it's interesting that what I'm going to read is not what's being bandied about, in clinics and up and down the country. No significant difference in incidence of shoulder dystocia was found between trial groups in the intention to treat analysis. No statistically significant differences were found in neonatal secondary outcomes. The number of adverse events was the same in both groups. Comparison of maternal and neonatal outcomes at 2 months and 6 months showed no differences between the two groups. So basically, there's no difference.
But that's a really interesting stat on its own, particularly 2 and 6 months, because what are the long-term implications, not the 2 and 6 month implications of inducing this many babies, many of whom ended up on antibiotics. There were higher rates of NICU readmission. One of the reasons the trial was more costly, I think it was Shelley who identified, it might have been Charlotte, is because the NICU on costs went up. So it made this more, and why did NICU on costs go up? Because there's no more need for NICU care, for neonatal care. It's just playing with numbers and figures. I think if I remember rightly, the PPH rates were high. So excessive bleeding for those listening.
Postpartum hemorrhage, yeah. This is the thing. There's so many outcomes that have just been shoved under the carpet, ignored, because that's not what they want to look at and that's not what they want to acknowledge. And again, they try to fudge the numbers because the study, quotes that they did find a very small reduction in shoulder dystocia with early induction, but only when they reanalyzed the results and they took out certain groups to make it fit their narrative.
I just got my hands over my face.
And that's the stat. That's the stat that's being that's the key takeaway that's being taken away and talked about with this study. That it did reduce shoulder dystocia, but it didn't. It's because you've taken a subset of the data out to make it fit the narrative that you want.
And reduce it compared to what? Reduce it compared to inducing later on? Or induce it compared to just leaving people have babies? They do not know. This study has told us absolutely, fuck all about big baby birth. Nothing. And they weren't big.
No.
Let's keep going back to, and when you terrorize women all of the time, this trial has been, well, you all know, and we've said it already. I don't understand how this trial was ethical. It didn't properly list the risks of induction, at least not on the original early patient leaflet, because I have a copy. It didn't really discuss the ongoing implications of induction. It didn't discuss the fact that when you induce a 38-week baby, because of the 2 week, and there's an estimated due dates can be 2 weeks out, you are potentially bringing your baby out at 36 weeks. You are potentially causing a medically premature baby, a baby who needs more help with feeding. What were the implications in terms of ongoing formula cost and use? Who knows?
Yeah.
And many women do not know that they've been birth traumatized. I did not know that I had birth trauma until 13 years later when I was having my second child. If you just said to me at the time, was I traumatized by my birth? I would have said no. But my first birth, and I've had 3 children since then, and they've been amazing, traumatized me so much I cannot have a smear test. Right? And I am 55. He is nearly 30. So yes, I had birth trauma. Was I aware? Completely oblivious.
Yeah. I think your point about forcing babies out early is a really important one. We're saying that they're in the study, they're inducing people at between 38 weeks and 38 plus 4. But we know that due dates are a guess, they're inaccurate. We don't know, you don't know what damage you're going to be doing by forcing that baby out early when they potentially could have another 4 weeks of development still needed. We are forcing babies out before they are ready to be born for a reason. If they need longer, they need more development. What's that impact on that baby's, like you said, the feeding impact, the impact on the baby's brain development, their nervous system?
I keep saying this, I think that we are causing neurological damage in birth, and it is presenting as neurodiversity. So both Erin and I want to be really clear here, because I think there is genetic neurodiversity that has always been there and will always be there. And I think, from what I'm reading, and this is just my own personal theory, I think that there is something that looks like neurodiversity, mimics neurodiversity, and so is being presented as autism, ADHD and things like that, but it's actually being caused by the amount of medical intervention in the birth room. Now, that's just a theory of mine. It's not, and I don't want anybody who's neurodiverse to go, Sam's trying to fix autism, because I'm not. I absolutely adore my children in every, even when they're being the biggest pains in the arse. But I think if we are causing neurological damage in the birth room, people need to start looking at. I might be completely wrong. I would be happy to be wrong, but I don't think that I'm wrong. I don't think that we can do this amount of things to babies at the end of pregnancy and in the birth room and it not have an impact, considering we are now looking at population level harm. We are harming people at such a great degree. And this trial, if it becomes common practice, which is why we were so eager to get this out so early, is going to cause harm. It's not going to help people to have more and more inductions.
Yeah. Induction in itself is a whole nother podcast episode, which I think I've recorded before, but maybe I'll do it again because I feel like it needs shouting about even louder. But the fact that an induction can cause a cascade of intervention, can cause a C-section, can mean, all of these synthetic hormones, pain relief drugs, the impact on breastfeeding, the impact on the baby's gut microbiome because of all the antibiotics that you get given, the increase in asthma, eczema, food allergies, all of these things stem from unnecessary interventions like induction. And a lot of those babies, 60% of those babies in that big baby trial arguably were intervened with unnecessarily. Now, if we apply that 60% to the entire population, that's a huge number of unnecessary inductions that are potentially going to happen because of a suspected big baby, because they fudged the numbers on this trial, which I think is criminal.
And my understanding, I only heard from like 2 healthcare professionals who were at their presentations, and I couldn't get my hands on any slides. But my understanding is they weren't presenting this. I might be wrong again, because this is third time, is they weren't presenting this as an outstanding success. And all of a sudden it seems to have gone into, look at this amazing trial, when very clearly by their own published paper, it wasn't. I don't understand how you can take something that clearly shows one thing and then try to get the narrative out there that this is amazing life-saving intervention for 2 big babies. And they were tragic, small, and I want to put my sympathies into those families. There were tragic outcomes on this trial.
Yeah, because there were some tragic outcomes on this trial, and you're right to acknowledge that as well.
It's I don't understand. I've been a birth worker, a trained birth worker for 12 years, and all I see is things getting worse.
Yeah.
Why are we not trialing? We know that one-to-one care. Why are they not trialing that? Why is this trial? How much money? I'd love to know. I don't know enough about research to know how much did this trial cost? And not just the cost of the trial. How much did it cost in hospital time, midwife time? It's out there. I know the information's out there, but a lot of money. When we are, my thoughts, I think that all hospitals who aren't graded excellent should be banned in taking part in research anyway. Because if you're not providing an excellent service and you're not meeting basics like good quality care, if your home birth services are closed, if your MLUs are being closed, how can you be participating in research that is being used to drive policy when you are a failing trust? And we know from CQC reports, trusts are failing left, right and centre.
Yeah.
So there's so many things about this trial. And then let's look at small baby, because the Perinatal Institute are also behind Gap Grow for small baby. So if we know that 60% of scans are inaccurate for big baby, where do we sit on small baby?
Yeah.
If it's using the same.
Yeah. I think one thing I think is important to point out for anybody that is pregnant and has a suspected big baby is that, and again, I'm reiterating, but I think it's because it's important. A, we don't know the size of your baby. And statistically, probably you are not having a mahoosive baby. Even if your baby is big, in most cases, that's not an issue.
Yeah.
Right? It's not an issue. We generally are designed to birth babies appropriate to our size, and again, I've had clients who, one of my couples, the person that was pregnant, she was like 5'9", 10. Her husband was over 6 foot. And they're like, we've been told we have to have an induction because we're having a big baby. Of course you're having a big baby. You're both tall. It's genetics.
And then there's also the issue that they get told they're going to have a big baby because their husbands are massive, but they don't calculate the husband's size in the growth charts.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I know. Make it make sense. Genetics plays a big part, right? There will be some people who have a suspected big baby and the baby is big and bigger than perhaps baby would be if you didn't have medical complications, like, undiagnosed, uncontrolled gestational diabetes, and your baby is growing exponentially, and that's affecting baby's growth. Yes, okay, potentially that's a different thing. But if we have an uncomplicated pregnancy and you are either genetically predisposed to have a big baby, or you're not, and we're just going for growth scans, and you have one erroneous measurement, it's probably not an issue. Let's not neglect, fundal height measurements as well, right? Because it's not just growth scans that identify big babies, it's fundal height measurements. So fundal height measurements is where the midwife gets the tape measure and she finds your pubic bone and she measures over your bump, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about the issue with that, Sam? Because you've got your hand on your head.
Firstly, it's an inaccurate measurement of anything. Yeah, it's like trying to measure the amount of bath water in a bath from the outside. But if there is no continuity, and how many are having continuity of care, then the fertile height measurements are not worth the ink that they are used to plot on a piece of paper. And I see hundreds of stories in the home birth group where people go, my midwife's done my frontal height measurement and she wants me to go for a growth scan, and it's like off the scale. It's either dropped off the bottom or it's shot up. And I say, the first question I ask is, was it your usual midwife? No, it's a different midwife. Well, there you go. No continuity. And then I'll say, oh, particularly if it's one of the late ones, where were you when this frontal height measurement was done? On the sofa. So if it's done on the sofa, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And when you start looking at frontal height measurements, again, they're just inaccurate. We know that the biggest thing that makes a difference is continuity of care for all of these things. And that includes your growth scans, because if your growth scans are done on different machines, or even by different sonographers, then they're inaccurate. They're not accurate. There's a slight difference in measurement. And my favourites are the ones that towards the end, the late scans, and they go, can't measure the baby's head, so we've guessed. And your baby's enormous, or your baby's tiny.
Yeah.
Because they've guessed. Would you accept this from your builder? Would you accept these inaccurate measurements if your builder came to the house and said, okay, Mrs., I've measured 2 bits, that'll do.
Yeah.
I'll just order. And you're going to be like, what? And frontal height measurements, do they have their place? Personally, actually, if I had my time again with my foot, I would never have bothered with them, but they certainly don't have their place if you don't have the same midwife in the same place. You're not in the same position. Think about your abdomen when you need a wee, or you're bloated because you've eaten something. That changes the size of what's going to happen. It's just basic. Basic. I'm not very good at science. I'm not very good at the medical. I understand birth, do not understand science a lot of the time. But even I can tell when something's just not right.
Yeah. And I think you touched on this, but the timing, where are you in your pregnancy? If you're being measured in your 3rd trimester, it is inevitably harder to accurately measure that baby because the baby is bigger. Their head's lower down. They can't get everything on the screen. We know that there is a statistical margin of error with measuring babies in the third trimester. Just as in general, there's a 15-20% margin of error with ultrasound scans, which actually doesn't sound like a very big, margin of error. That's huge. That's huge. That's having an 8-pound baby and being told you're having somewhere between a 6 and a 9 pound. That's massive, right? I don't know kilograms. I'm old. Okay, I do
Yeah,
pounds and
same.
ounces. I'm really sorry for anyone listening.
And then something else I read, I haven't fact checked it, but it makes sense to me. Baby boys weigh more than baby girls
Hmm.
as well.
Hmm.
So on average, a pound difference at birth. But as I said, I haven't checked that out, but I can imagine it's probably true. It's like, if that's true, then does that not put everything into jeopardy? Because it's another thing that these scans don't account for, or the
Yeah,
charts don't. It's not the
yeah.
scans. I'm just,
Or with or parity. Like I mean, in my personal, this is just me
yeah.
personally, but my first child was 6 pounds. My second child was 6 pounds 7, and my third child, who's a boy, was 7 pounds 7, and they got progressively bigger.
Mm.
Now I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's a trend, across everybody else, that you tend to have bigger babies as you have more babies potentially, but that doesn't get factored into growth scans and measurements either, does it?
Mine all got bigger from £7 to £8.10. Or I
Yeah.
think that one might even have been bigger again. I can't remember. And even that, I was, it's going to be a really big baby.
Mm,
Why are they trying to frighten everyone?
yeah.
So, back to this trial, NICU readmissions, the amount of people going back into hospital was high. The amount of babies ending up on antibiotics was high.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's the other, not spoken about impact of this trial that I think is really worrying, because we're not talking about they're just focusing on the shoulder dystocia, which it didn't show anyway. By the way.
When I read the trial, and I got to be honest, I zoned out after about 2 minutes of trying to read it. Didn't it contradict itself though? Didn't it say there wasn't a difference and there was a difference in the
Yeah.
trial?
Yeah. Not to mention that there was a whole load of typos. It was riddled with typos. And I'm not talking just there was grammatical errors, but there was also numbers were wrong. So you were trying to interpret the data and you couldn't, because there was typos in the data. The references, when you look through the study and you look for a reference, it actually points to the wrong reference in at the end of the study. I mean, the whole thing is just, I am used to reading studies. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm used to interpreting data. That's I live and breathe for reading a really good research study, and I really struggled. And this is something that I was speaking to Charlotte the Smart Doula, who I'm going to publish
Yeah.
her podcast episode later, about interpreting data. As a pregnant person, you are relying on your midwife, on your obstetrician, to be telling you information from these studies to say whether your care is evidence-based or not. And they are getting it wrong. They are picking the wrong things out of this study. They are warping what the outcomes of this study were. So this is a real issue.
I'm just sat here shaking my head because in my experience, they don't know the studies, they don't read
No,
the research, they don't keep up to date. They are told that this study says this, and then that's what they go with.
and that's what
And
they
when you sit
regurgitate.
there and
Absolutely.
ask them,
Yeah.
I've been in meetings where they get offended because you ask for evidence. I've had clients and I've said to them, ask them for the evidence because they won't have it. And they'll say to them, oh, go and look for the Cochrane study. That is not your healthcare provider giving you evidence.
Yeah.
Right? That is them telling you to go and do your own research.
Yeah.
And, there is so little research on leaving birth alone
Mm.
that I don't, as far as I'm concerned, all research that we have, all of it now, is fundamentally flawed. It's all dated. None of it accounts for the amount of cesareans and inductions that we're doing now. Even this trial is dated. It was dated before it even came out, because
Yeah.
it started in 2019 when induction rates have gone through the roof.
Yeah.
So it's just, there is no longer in this, well, anywhere, I don't think, a baseline of leave it alone. And, when we're looking at stillbirth rates and things like that, going back to 2019, what relevance have they got to a world in which 70% of people are being induced in cesareans?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
nobody wants a stillbirth, but they still happen, and they're happening more.
No, you know what? I just downloaded the latest ONS data and Embrace data report and updated my graph. So there's a graph that I share periodically, and I think if I haven't shared it this week, it's going live next week, looking at the rates of stillbirths and the rates of induction, C-sections and postpartum hemorrhages. Stillbirth rate hasn't changed. Induction, C-section and postpartum hemorrhage rates have gone through the roof. And again, looking at 2024 data, the trend is the same, right?
And
These inductions are not preventing stillbirths.
No, I thought it got up slightly, or might not have this time, because
I think it's the same. It's roughly the same.
But and we know that some trusts are changing what classes as a postpartum hemorrhage, but they're not changing what classes as a postpartum hemorrhage when they want to traumatise you into having an induction next time. They're only changing it for their stats. When you go in, they're still classing 500 mil, which used to be normal bleed anyway. They just change things as they feel like it. And this trial is just an absolute clear example of how they're manipulating what is going on, as well as how they manipulated and ran the trial in the first place.
Yeah. So I think the key things I want people to take away from listening to this episode is that if you're being told you're having a big baby, it's probably not big.
Yep.
If they are big, it's probably not an issue. If they're telling you your big baby is going to cause a shoulder dystocia and brachial plexus palsy and permanent damage, statistically it's very unlikely to happen. And actually the study showed that actually there were more cases of brachial plexus palsy in the early induction group than there were for the people that had standard care, again, air quote. And I think this is I think it's so important that as a pregnant person, you have support from somebody who is impartial and can give you some of this information and understands a lot of this stuff, because I don't think you can rely on your care provider, your NHS care provider, to be giving you this information in an unbiased way, or someone who really understands the data that's coming out of these studies. So having like a one-to-one with Sam, for example, and booking some time in with her, if you're being told that you need an induction for a big baby, I think is a really good idea. Coming and booking on a course with me to understand what your options are and the impact of some of these medical interventions, so that you can make a balanced decision on what you want that birth to look like and what decisions you want to make in the birth room, I think is really important. And as data like this comes out, we saw it with the ARRIVE trial, we're seeing it with the Big Baby trial. These studies are being used to justify medical intervention, when actually the studies show the opposite, potentially.
And I'll add to Erin that anybody, right, so any healthcare professional that is suggesting to you to use CTG is lying, because the use of CTG or continuous monitoring in your birth is another thing that has no evidence base. Birth small talk on Instagram is the absolute go-to. I send everybody there. But they are relying on a technology to save your baby, because we know that induction stresses babies. That has no evidence base. So the whole thing is a shamble in non-evidence-based practice. Women and babies and birthing people are the biggest uncontrolled experiment in the world. They are experimenting on us, and they are experimenting on our babies.
Yeah.
And you need to not blindly trust, and that includes, don't just blindly trust us either.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do your own work. Do your own research. We are not anti-induction. I have been to inductions. I regularly speak to people who are being induced all of the time. And I don't sit there going, don't be induced. If somebody comes to me because they're being induced, I will support them to have the best possible induction that they can. And in my considerable experience, and people need to understand, no, I'm not medically trained. I don't claim to be, and I'm not giving medical advice. I read thousands of birth stories a year. I have probably read more birth stories than anybody that I know on a regular basis. And when induction is medically genuinely indicated, it goes well.
Yeah.
Because the body knows.
Yeah.
Right? When you have been coerced and beaten and battered into it, it does not go well, because it is not the right thing to be doing. Yeah. Induction, when it comes from your own heart, I had 2 clients of beautiful inductions because they knew it was the right thing to do. they believed that they were doing the right thing, and they weren't in a fear state when they went in, and it makes such a difference. And this trial put so many people in a fear state. It was always going to be a bad trial.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Sam, because you're right. Not all inductions are unnecessary. Some of them are medically necessary, absolutely, and they can go really well. But this study particularly is going to be a stick to beat people into submission for induction.
How can they say that this trial says anything about big babies when their own, we're back to where we started, their own stats say 60% of them weren't big, and that's not accounting for the fact there is no evidence for the use of growth scans for big babies. They've only ever been evidenced for small babies. And as I said, because we're back into repeating, this casts that into doubt in my mind.
Yeah.
Because I've always known that the lack of continuity made it pointless.
Yeah.
So I think we could go around in circles with this, because it is the most frustrating. And it's not just you, Erin, who said that it was hard to unpick this trial. Charlotte, as Erin has mentioned, and Shelley Potier spent a whole day backing and forthing with each other trying to unpick this trial.
Yeah.
Because and Charlotte is a researcher.
And
Shelley is amazing with research. Shelley, Erin, and Charlotte, my three go-to for evidence-based. Look at what they've said about the research, rather than just me ranting away about how terrible it is. But they couldn't understand it either, even two of them batting their heads together. And have I got it wrong? I can't remember which bits they thought they got wrong. But it was like, have we read this wrong? Are we?
Yeah. No, I feel like potentially it is written in such a way to make it so hard to understand that they can try and just push the narrative that they want. I feel like it's almost intentional. So yeah, I think do your own research. There is lots of information about big babies out there, and a lot of it backs what we're saying.
Do you know the best place to read about big babies? Come into my home birth group, get into my big baby group, guys, and read stories from women who have had big babies, their own big babies, their own stories in their own words. Nothing is censored in my home birth group. Nothing. Every story that somebody I regularly speak to people, and they say, I don't know if my story's for the group. I say, if you're in the group and you'll remember, your birth story is important. However it happened, whatever happened, there is nothing that doesn't come into this group. Come and read the stories from people who have actually had big babies at home with no intervention, and see the difference in how they talk, even when they've had intervention, in how they talk about their births compared to what we are seeing in the constant trauma stories that we see in trials like this. It's just appalling.
I will make sure that the link to your group is in the show notes so that people can join. Thank you so much for your time today, Sam. It's been, as always, a pleasure. I love a good rant. I feel like I've kind of got a lot off my chest today.
Even my poor teenagers who are 12, 15 and 17 and have genuinely no interest in the big baby trial have done nothing but listen to me rant about this trial since the paper came, since the BBC put their article out selling this trial as giving women choice. That gave me the rage that hasn't really dissipated, because what choice? The choice that they took away. This trial changed how big babies were treated within the NHS before it was ever published. And I read that and I was like, oh my God, they're going to start selling this as a saviour. And I haven't stopped. So my 12-year-old is like, you could just see him like, why are you talking to me about this? I'm not interested. So, you have always had choice.
Yes.
This trial tried to take it away.
Yeah, absolutely.
And breathe. And thank you for having me to rant. Rant with Sam.
It's always good. Thank you for your time. And if anyone does want to reach out to me or to Sam, I'll make sure that all of our contact details in the show notes. But just don't take the headlines at face value. Make sure you're getting your information from more balanced sources, not the BBC or, you know, any other big media outlet, because the journalists that are writing those articles are not birth workers, they're not doulas, they're not midwives, they're not obstetricians, they're journalists, and they don't know what they're talking about, quite frankly. So make sure you're getting information from somebody that does know what they're talking about.
And even sadly, you know, I'm going to say this and then we're going to have to end, but even sadly, the birth trauma inquiry and Theo Clark, I know she's coming from a good place, but the recommendations in that were abysmal and another source of harm for those giving birth. You know, there's so much going on that from people who don't really understand birth.
Yeah. Thank you so much for today.
I can't wait for your one with Charlotte. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I've got an amazing birth story to publish, and then Charlotte's is gonna go live, and yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one to understand the issues of trying to interpret data and research studies, which we've touched on today. So yeah, it's a good one. Thank you, Sam.